So much of our storytellers today have deep roots and connections in Tacoma, and Bev Grant, you are in many ways Tacoma royalty. You were the first African-American daffodil princess, representing Stadium High School in 1969. And your father was a major leader in Tacoma. He helped so many people. And you went on to practice law in California and Washington and served as a Pierce County Superior Court judge from 2003 to 2013. And after you retired, you then went on to open up your own law practice in 2014. And you're also the mother of 2 grown children. What brought you to Tacoma in the first place, Bev?
I wanted to see the World's Fair. My father was an officer, and we lived over in Broadmoor in Fort Lewis, and I was the oldest of 5, and I said, Dad, I want to see what this World's Fair is about. So the closest military base was Fort Lewis, and that's how we got here. And when we got here, I've heard these stories from my father. He was a later, he worked at the anti-poverty program as executive director, and then later was appointed by 5 governors, 2 R's and 3 D's on the state parole board. But he told me of stories where he tried to live, set up a family home in, first it was Parkland, and he was discriminated against there because of his skin color. And then in Fircrest, where he had a captain friend who was willing to sell him his house. And my father said, he said, well, George, I don't know if you want to move your family here because some of the neighbors might not like having, might not like having blacks in our neighborhood. And my father was rather an optimist. I don't know why. He was born in Texas. He should have known better. But he said, well, let's just have a neighborhood meeting, and I'm sure I can persuade them that we're just like normal people and should be allowed to live in Fircrest. Well, the neighbor bought in a sawed-off shotgun, and so Dad said he got the message rather fast, and we didn't move there. So in the early 60s, the areas where African Americans could only find homes was in the Hilltop area. And so that's where we lived. I attended McCarver Junior, well, I attended military school. And then when we moved to Hilltop, I was at McCarver for a couple of months and became Miss Magnificent at McCarver. And so I got beat up a lot at McCarver. There was a gang there, women's gang, where I was forced to do homework for one of the participants. And I did it for a good year, and then finally I spoke up to Ruby Harris and some others and told them what was going on. And it's kind of interesting. 50 plus years later, I'm at a Bible study at Charles Weatherby, Chana Weatherby's house. And I was telling this story how I went to McCarver and used to get beat up by this one participant. And one of the members called out her name. She beat me up too. So I learned a lot from that experience. 1, I learned how to fight back a little bit, and 2, I learned that the equipment in schools, it wasn't the desire of the teachers, because I'm one to believe that we should be paying and supporting our teachers much more than what we ever have. But the books and the equipment were so antiquated. Military schools are usually far advanced than civilian schools. But this one, there was such a large disparity that I literally began to tutor other kids there. And so I left McCarver, and I ended up at Stadium. And that too was an experience. I graduated, I think, it's either 28 or 26 out of 400 and something students. But that still wasn't enough, because the counselor there, when we got ready to decide, whether you're going to college, that was never a point of discussion, because we all knew we were going to college. But what was interesting was the college recruiter who was our counselor at Stadium, even though I was in the top 1% of my class, it still wasn't good enough because she told me that, she said, well, what do you want to do? I said, well, I've always wanted to either be a doctor or a lawyer. And she said, well, your people can't do that. And I said, why can't I do that? She said, well, you can be a teacher. And I said, well, I like teachers, that's fine, but I want to be a doctor or a lawyer. And she said, no, you can't do that. So I remember going back to my parents and telling them, in our family, there wasn't any words like I can't. And I said, I was told today that I can't be a lawyer or a doctor because I'm black. And so that resonated with me later in life, and it was really easy which one I wanted to do. One, they said I was always arguing or fighting with somebody. And two, I just didn't like anybody else's blood other than my own, so I couldn't even be a nurse in Rosa. It was too painful just even taking off a Band-Aid. I'd spent 2 hours trying to do that. So that decided my fate. I wanted to be a lawyer.
What did you learn from your father? Your father had such a strong role in Hilltop and giving back to the community. What did you learn from him about what it meant to give back?
I learned a lot of things. When you're in the Army setting, you're sort of like in a utopia. You don't realize really what was going on the outside. And so during that time when there were riots and a lot of upheaval, I had a hard time initially grasping what was going on because I thought everyone was being treated, at least with the basic essentials, like we got on base, especially the officers. I mean, if you wanted to move, somebody came and packed you up. You had a lot of resources. I soon learned, once we lived in Hilltop, that wasn't true. And my father was on the anti-poverty program. I think it was MDC or something. But I remember him hiring Harold Moss and Tom Ditson and some other people. But one of the things Tacoma is a very cohesive group. And if you come from the outside, no matter how educated you are, no matter how talented you are, you have a battle to confront because people like their own inside people. And it's to the detriment a lot, I think, of Tacoma. So Dad was able to overcome a lot of obstacles. He hired Jack Tanner to be his lawyer when we couldn't live in Parkland and Fircrest. And then many, many years later, I ended up being Tanner's law clerk. And that was very educational in and of itself. But I've always been taught that you can't lay dormant. You have to fight for what you believe in, and you have to respect those who have come before you, who have paved the way, and never ever forget from whence you've come, because you know what? You may have to go back the same way. So I found that there was a lot of things that could be done here, and I was always interested in pursuing different things. So what that meant was I had to be very selective in the friends that I chose. I surrounded myself with people who were doers, people who said I can do or I will do, and did it. People who would not downplay a suggestion if you wanted to try something new. People who were energetic and innovative and wanted to make a contribution of some sort. So if you were the couch potato and you were the type that were always downing who was this and who was that and had nothing good to say or positive to say, I dumped you. I wasn't around you. I found that you would bring me down. If I stayed with you, I would end up adopting your principles. So to this day, I've always encouraged others, it's not the quantity of the friends that you have. It's the quality of those few friends that you share that can make all the difference. And that's what I did.
You talk about you may have to come back, and you are back in Tacoma after having had a career and a life also in LA. And in LA, you tried some very big cases with very high-profile clients. What did you learn from doing that?
I was very fortunate. The same thing in Tacoma. When I practiced for about 5 or 6 years in Tacoma, I was one of 3 women who had their own practices in Tacoma. And all of us had different stories to tell because we were totally discouraged about having our own practices. I had opportunities to work for the 2 largest law firms here in Tacoma, and I decided I wanted to have my own. And so I went and applied at 3 banks. And 2 of those banks gave me, I was working for a law firm, making 18 grand a year, and but I was bringing in $500,000 a year. And so I finally woke up and said, you know, there's something wrong with this equation. If I can bring in $500,000 for them and only get 18,000, maybe I could bring in $500,000 and keep some of that. And so I had good credit, and I went out and sought the help of some bank officers, and was granted 2 loans of $30,000 each. And I'll tell you, I had never seen $30,000. So I did like any person of my age would do. I partied with that money. I was a skier, so I went to all the ski resorts I wanted to go to. I bought art and sculpture, and I had a great time. And then I suddenly woke up and thought, Bev, you're going to have to pay this back, you know. And so I had my own practice, and I forgot about, you know, taxes. And so I won a very significant case, both in California. I was going to work part-time, and I had 2 children that I had stayed at home 4 years. But I had what I now recognize to be a virtual office here in Tacoma. And most people never knew I left because I was here. It was just a plane ride. I was here once a month, and my phones had local numbers that ring downtown LA. And when I moved back, I did the flip-flop. And so after I stayed at home, and I had a case up in Washington. I had specialized in sexual harassment at the time. And I had a case, and I wrote a letter between the breastfeeding of my daughter. And it was a 13-page letter, but I didn't have a fax machine. And so my husband at the time was a municipal bond attorney, and so he had plenty of fax machines downtown. They sent the letter off. The first counter came back at $2.50. And he says, wait a minute, how much time have you spent on this letter? I said, well, between changing the diapers and breastfeeding, I think maybe 13 hours off and on. He says, your first offer is $2.50. Are you going to take it? I said, hell no, I'm not going to take that. And so we ended up selling for almost $500,000. It took me 30 hours of work, which included 2 physical trips from Tacoma to LA round trip. And so my husband said, well, maybe you do want to go back into private practice. And so I did. I said, well, I'll work part-time. First couple of cases, I represented a wardrobe costumer. We sued Fred Savage on the Wonder Years for sexual harassment. They had roughly 6 lawyers, 2 from New York, the prestigious Paul Hastings law firm, and a couple others, and me. And they filed the equivalent of 13 motions to dismiss. I won all of the 13 except 1 because I sued Dan Lauria and I couldn't find him. He was hiding doing a movie called The Twister. And I wasn't a movie fan, so I didn't know he was doing that. And then the second case, I sued Will Smith on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. I represented Janet Hubert Whitten, who played Aunt Viv, and that's a story in itself. But Will was real decent about it. We had to send out, at the time, my husband and I had 30 employees, and we had to send out a memo, do not ask Will Smith for his autograph. And my kids will tell you that to this day, they remember that because our nanny would not bring him to the office, and they were very upset about that. Because they wanted Will's autograph. And then I sued the CEO of Xerox And that brought me all related to sexual harassment incidences. And so when I flip-flopped and came back here, I had always had an interest in doing judgeship work, and eventually the opportunity, they had been asking me if I had an interest in my late 20s, and so finally I decided in my mid-50s, well, you know, maybe you better take it or you may not have another opportunity. And so you make choices, and sometimes those choices are great and sometimes they aren't. But one of the things I discovered was two things. One day, for those who are young or those who still believe they're young, or those who still want to be young, one day you will come across an obstacle and you will not know how to deal with that obstacle. And so for me, there was a mother who came. She was telling all the major networks that I represented her. I had no idea what her case was about because she hadn't called me, but the networks were calling me. And so I just kind of fronted them off and I said, Lord, please have this lady call me. I don't even know what her case is about. And her case was in defense of her son who had been expelled from a local school, and we were able to take care of that situation. She couldn't afford to pay me, and so I told her to bring in her children. She had 7 kids, and I said, I want you to bring in all your kids into my office on Saturday. And I told the kids, you know, your mother couldn't pay me, but you are going to pay me back. And they ranged from 5 on up to 14, and the oldest one was like 16, and said, we don't have any money, we don't have any jobs, how are we going to pay you back? And I said, what's your name? So I went through each one of them, had them announce their name and their age and what they wanted to be when they would grow up. And I said, one day you're going to be that fireman, and you're going to be that veterinarian, and you're going to be that basketball player. Each of you will be in a position to help someone else like I was able to help your mother today. She had no money, and maybe they won't have any money, and maybe they won't even look like you. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you will be in a position to extend a helping hand. And I want you to make a promise to me today that when that time comes, you will remember your promise to me that you will give and help someone else like I help your mother today. So I asked them, can you do that for me? And they said, all of them said yes. And I said, that will be my payment. Just remember that you are in a powerful position to help others. And don't forget to do that. So that was that story.
Thank you so much, Bev. And I think maybe you could probably do it with the entire audience, and we'd all repay you as well right now. We're going to all do our best. Thank you so much, Bev.